Hi there, welcome back to the Simply Scrupulosity podcast. My name is Abby Tabilos, and this is episode number 28. That number just keeps getting higher and higher, and that makes me so happy. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting the podcast. I hope, as always, that episodes are insightful and helpful for you in your journey to either learn more about obsessive-compulsive disorder or move toward OCD recovery in your own life. Today's episode is based upon the sheer number of messages that I get in my inbox that are about using avoidance as a compulsion as somebody with scrupulosity OCD. And I hear about avoidance with scrupulosity OCD so often that I would not be surprised if almost every single person who has this condition struggles with this compulsion at one point or another. And that's why I wanted to address it, because I think this compulsion can be particularly tricky, at least in my own experience, because when you avoid, and in this specific context on my channel, I do know that scrupulosity OCD can encompass morality and or religion. A lot of the time on this channel, we do focus more on the religious side. And so just keep that in mind as you're listening. You can also apply it if you struggle with the more morality side of things. But at least when it comes to avoiding religious triggers when you have scrupulosity OCD, when you do that compulsion for long enough, or when you're so comfortable just doing that to cope with the anxiety and intrusive thoughts, I think that it creates this illusion that you are getting better, that the scrupulosity OCD is going away because you're avoiding all of the triggers. And you're so focused on not exposing yourself to things that could ramp up the OCD that you may think you're not experiencing a ramp up in the OCD as often as you were before, when in reality, you've just gotten so good at doing this compulsion that maybe your anxiety levels aren't getting as high sometimes because you're just kind of immediately coping with the compulsion. And I know that that may not be true for everyone, but at least in my experience, I think avoidance as a compulsion when it comes to religious OCD or scrupulosity OCD can create the illusion that you've healed and gotten better. And I wanted to address that because at the end of the day, and I talked about this with my therapist as well, you could feel better in the moment, but it's almost like you've created this situation where the scrupulosity OCD is like a scary monster that's following you around your life, and it's always there waiting. As soon as there's a trigger coming up, it's going to jump right in. And we don't want that, because recovery is about not feeling like the OCD is looming and scaring you. It's feeling empowered to address the anxiety and intrusive thoughts that could come up without it being so debilitating. And so I just wanted to clarify, avoidance is not healing, even though sometimes we might feel like it is. However, the messages that I get about avoidance, they're almost always coming from a place of some sort of distress, in the sense that these individuals who've had scrupulosity obsessive-compulsive disorder, essentially, religion has been their entire identity for most likely years and years and years. And maybe it feels like caring so much about religion and morality is your personality, or was your personality. And when you start avoiding, it can be distressing because you worry what the relief you feel about avoiding says about you as a person. And it's almost like this shocking, who am I really moment? And you worry and start to spiral. Does this mean I've lost all my faith? am I just completely lost as a person? Why does it feel better to avoid things when I thought religion mattered so much to me? And that's just evidence that avoidance is a compulsion because it spurs additional intrusive thought OCD cycles. But I think it also just testifies to the fact that A, intrusive thoughts don't say anything about your character and who you are as a person. And B, it reinforces that idea that avoidance is not healing because all it's doing is strengthening the power that OCD has over you. But I did want to mention and validate that experience because I had that experience and I felt like I lost my entire sense of self and I was so confused because I never in a million years would have thought I would be a person who struggled with avoiding religion. I thought I would always be all in. And it's disorienting and scary, and there's a whole other layer of difficulty when it comes to familial relationship dynamics because since scrupulosity OCD is such a misunderstood condition, there is a chance that if you happen to start falling into avoidance as a compulsion, the people in your life could simply just assume, oh, they lost their faith, they're less active. I can't believe this happened to them, simply because understanding how OCD works and that avoidance is a compulsion is not widespread knowledge, and it's hard to explain, especially if they've never been there. And so I just wanted to validate, as I'm going through how to avoid avoidance when you have scrupulosity OCD, I want listeners to know that I'm coming from a place of recognizing how difficult it is to try to overcome the compulsion while also all of this other stuff is going on, because it's emotional and terrifying. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but I really just wanted to say that before I jumped into things. That being said, I also wanted to talk a little bit about why avoidance as a compulsion may come up, because in a lot of cases, and speaking from my own experience, a lot of the time, avoidance isn't necessarily the first compulsion that somebody with religious OCD experiences or goes to. Typically, that person is the opposite with religion, and they're over repenting and confessing and ruminating and praying and asking for reassurance and researching. And so, why and how do we eventually get to a place where avoidance is a compulsion? And obviously that contributes to the confusion of why people message me like, what's going on? Why am I avoiding? Like, I feels like I did a complete 180. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but as I sat and thought about it, I realized that one reason could be that it could get to a point where the OCD has convinced the sufferer that they are no longer worthy to participate in certain religious activities or actions. And so that becomes so painful and real that avoiding those religious actions feels good as a compulsion. So for example, within my own faith, which I know it can be repetitive if you're a regular listener, but I always want to say, just for people who are just tuning in for the first time, I did grow up a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so I do use a lot of examples from that specific religion, just because that's my experience. But if you look at somebody with scrupulosity within that church that I grew up in, perhaps as the OCD hounds on you about repenting for your sins and being worthy, there's a lot of talk already about worthiness within that faith when it comes to going into the temple or taking the sacrament on Sundays. So there could become a point where the intrusive thoughts and the anxiety are coming up so much before the worthiness check temple recommend interview that it's so terrifying that you just don't go to the temple recommend interview and stop going to the temple, or you just don't take the sacrament on Sunday. because you don't feel worthy to, because of what your mind is telling you. And I think that happens a lot, but I do know that it's complicated because it's a big deal to not have your temple recommend. And so that is a whole other can of worms. Another reason I think the avoidance as a compulsion comes up is when scrupulosity OCD sufferers experience burnout. And from what I've noticed, and with me and a few friends who have the disorder, is that you live your life for so long, you don't even know you have religious OCD. You're just living how you know how and how your mind tells you to. Then you get diagnosed and you start treatment and you feel like a deer in the headlights. You're like, holy cow, this OCD is so much more involved in my life than I ever realized. You get a little bit overwhelmed. You start working through treatment, whether it's exposure and response prevention or ICBT, whatever it is. And then you get even more anxious because you're not doing compulsions. And all of a sudden, church and praying and scripture reading and everything religious starts to feel like a homework assignment for therapy and an exposure, rather than why people are religious, which is to feel comfort and peace, feel close to God, become a better person. It takes away all of that. And then I think for a lot of people, that is when the sneaky compulsion of avoidance comes up, because it's like, church isn't church anymore. Praying isn't praying anymore. Everything's changed. It's too much because now I don't know what that says about my faith. And I just can't. I cannot do it. I'm too overwhelmed. And then you just avoid. You're not healing. You're just avoiding because it's too much. And from what I understand in a lot of messages I get, I think this is the most common reason avoidance starts coming up as a compulsion. But the last thing I want to mention is that along the same veins of worthiness, I think a last reason that avoidance may come up as a compulsion could just be because you feel like you could never complete a religious task well enough for it to be good enough, so you just avoid it. So I can never repent right, so I just won't think about repentance or prayer. The list could go on, and honestly, I will say that second reason is my experience with avoidance as a compulsion for scrupulosity, but I would love to hear any and all other experiences. So please feel free to reach out to me. I love to talk in my DMs, and I have been toying with the idea of starting to have guests on the podcast to talk through their experiences and stories. And so if you're interested, let me know. I think that could be really helpful for a lot of people. And just to be a little bit more specific with how and why avoidance comes up with scrupulosity OCD, because I'm aware that not everybody who listens to my show has a disorder, and some of them have loved ones and they want to understand it better. So I just really want to be crystal clear, because I think this can be a very emotionally loaded compulsion. And just piggybacking off of that idea of you start to get overwhelmed when you realize how much scrupulosity is in your life and entangled in your life, and then also religion just starts to feel like therapy rather than religion, and then avoidance comes up. That's exactly what happened in my experience. It was about, I would say, a year after my scrupulosity OCD diagnosis when I started getting to that point, because it did take some time to get to those more heavy-hitting exposures, like skipping church or not saying a prayer one night or whatever it might be. And that's when I really started struggling, because I felt like I began to grieve and mourn what I thought religion used to be to me. And there was a lot of parts of that because I was recognizing that what religion was to me was a lot of that was an illusion, because it was the OCD cycle just repeatedly happening in my life. And that was confusing. And B, it was also remembering that I did have positive experiences in religion and feeling like those were gone because it was all just exposures. And it was all just, oh, you have to change this to get better. And I just felt like I lost a big piece of myself, a big piece of my life. And it felt like I couldn't express that to my loved ones because I was afraid they would think I just was wanting to leave the church. And I felt like no one could understand what I was going through. I avoided, but I felt so much guilt and shame about avoiding because it was like, okay, my therapist told me not to go to church this week as an exposure. So my whole Sunday is going to stink. I'm going to be anxious because I wasn't sick, but I didn't go to church. And it was awful. And then the next week, going to church felt a little scary because then I felt guilty that I didn't go to church for no reason. So then I wondered if I was worthy to go. And I started thinking that my own treatment for OCD was a sin. And so I got really anxious. But the avoidance eventually started to relieve the anxiety and feel better because I didn't have to go face what religion had become for me, which was a temporary, I didn't know this at this time, but it was a temporary anxiety-inducing torture experience. And I didn't want to face that. I didn't want to face going to church and having to walk out of meetings to walk the halls because I was so anxious I was going to have a panic attack in the middle of meetings. I didn't want that for myself. I didn't want to figure out what that meant about my faith and my future. And I froze. And avoidance became the only thing that took the anxiety away. Just push it away, push it away, push it away. And I just really want to reinforce that for the people who are listening to the show to understand, because it's hard to articulate that as a scrupulosity OCD sufferer to anyone because you're afraid of being judged and misunderstood. But I just want to let everyone know how painful that is for the OCD sufferer, that they don't want to be in that place, that they're going through something really hard and earth-shattering for them, life-shattering. And it's very isolating. And so as a loved one, being the person who won't judge, even if you might not understand, or be afraid for them because suddenly they're not so obsessed with being perfect and worthy and following all the rules, and not telling them that that scares you for them, that's huge. Because trust me, they're already thinking that themselves. And they need people who will support them in their journey to interact with religion in a healthier way. And also, of course, if you are a scrupulosity OCD sufferer listening to this, I wanted to reiterate that just so that you know that you're not alone and that you feel seen, because it's horrendous. This was probably the second worst part of my scrupulosity OCD healing journey. But now to get to the meat of the episode, I suppose, which is the title, How to Avoid Avoidance When You Have Scrupulosity OCD. And of course, a disclaimer here, please don't listen to my show as a replacement for therapy. I know it's hard because therapy is not always accessible to everyone, but it really is so important to work with a therapist trained and authorized to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder, even better if they have experience with religious or scrupulosity OCD. Of course, everything I'm sharing when I say here's some tips, it's coming from what I learned in therapy. I'm not just making it up. But that being said, I'm not licensed. I'm here to make you feel seen and share what I've learned, but please don't underestimate the importance of receiving your own personalized treatment and working with a professional. That being said, one thing that my therapist taught me when I was going through this and trying to articulate the struggles of that to her was that it's so important, as you would with any intrusive thought, any compulsion, to try to remove the emotional attachment that you have to those thoughts and compulsions, and to just treat it as you would any other compulsion. And I know that this is so much easier said than done, and I know how frustrating it can be to just have people say like, oh, just don't care about the thoughts you get. I know, but it really is, if you can work towards practicing removing the fear and emotional attachment from what the OCD is telling you and urging you to do. That will be so helpful when it comes to avoiding avoidance. For example, if you take the situation that I just shared where I am going to church and I'm getting so anxious during the meeting that I'm having to leave and go walk around the hallways to calm myself down because I was in the middle of exposure therapy while I was at church in the meeting. That's the situation I'm in. I'm walking the halls. I'm having thoughts that my faith is lost, doesn't mean anything anymore because this used to not be my experience. It's pathetic that I can't even handle sitting through a church meeting. What is God thinking about me? There can be any number of thoughts going through your head. You could be worrying about what other people think. You could be wondering what your future's going to look like. Anything. And those are thoughts that can bring up a lot of emotion and they can bring up a lot of fear. Trust me, the amount of times I left church sobbing to my husband during Scrupulosity OCD treatment before the avoidance got really strong is countless. The healing comes in when you're walking the halls, you're getting those thoughts at church, and you're able to say, for example, you get the thought, I've lost all my faith because this is my experience at church now. You can react to that thought with, I'm doing OCD treatment right now, and I can't say anything about where my faith is because I'm focusing on getting better. There's a million different ways to see it, to say it. And some of the things my therapist said were moving towards what scares you was one that she brought up, which is basically, oh, I've lost my faith, rather than being like, oh my gosh, that's a terrifying thought. I really didn't. I still have it. Just saying, well, maybe my faith is lost in the sense that it's not the same as it was, but maybe that's not a bad thing because I'm restructuring how I interact with it to be healthy. And it's jumping into it, and obviously with a therapist, moving through what about that is so scary and talking through and facing the fears, because that's the way you overcome them. And I know it's overwhelming because you have like 5 million fears when you have religious OCD, and don't place these crazy high expectations on yourself to suddenly just not emotionally react to your intrusive thoughts. Please do one at a time. Don't overwhelm yourself. But moving towards what scares you and not putting up your walls and immediately resorting to avoidance because you're so scared, that's a great step to take towards avoiding avoidance. It's hard almost to record the podcast episode because I know there's so many different case-by-case bases and what exactly you're scared of and what your mind is telling you and why you're avoiding. But as a blanket statement, that is a very empowering thing my therapist taught me is you don't have to run away from what scares you. Another thing she taught me, and also that I hear all the time in the OCD recovery space, is sitting with discomfort. And I used to get so annoyed because I heard all the time, sit with your anxiety. I never knew what that meant. No matter how many times people explained that to me, I just had no idea what was going on. But it's essentially just the art and the practice of that anxiety's coming up because you got the intrusive thought and you are describing what it feels like and you're not doing a compulsion. No, it does not mean that you can't go on a walk or read your book or whatever. It just means you acknowledge it without immediately trying to do something to cope with it. That's what I learned. And that took me like a really long time to learn. It was so confusing for me. Another just kind of last way to look at this removing emotional attachment from avoidance and intrusive thoughts is to be mindful. Another therapy cliche that I heard all the time from my therapist, but it's really just being able to notice and acknowledge what comes up without letting it say anything about you. Maybe you get the thought your faith is lost. You're just like, that's a thought that I got. And I used to imagine, as I love the ocean, so I used to imagine that as I was getting intrusive thoughts and I noticed them, I would write them in my mind in the sand on the shore of a beach. And then I would look at it and I would watch a wave come and wipe the thought away. Not because I'm trying to get rid of it, but just because that helped me remember that thoughts come and go. And at the end of the day, thoughts are just thoughts. And if it's, I lost my faith, that doesn't have to be a big scary monster. I can just notice it. Again, all of this stuff takes practice, but I think being aware of and having reminders of the goal, you can take little baby steps and work with a therapist and slowly move towards OCD recovery. And I just want to reiterate that as you work towards overcoming the compulsion of avoidance, please be patient with yourself. Beating yourself up for giving in and doing a compulsion or getting emotionally worked up over an intrusive thought or whatever it is, that's never the answer, because let me tell you, OCD is a serious disorder and it can take time. It does take time to recover. It took me nearly 2 years after I was diagnosed to enter a place of recovery. And let me tell you, that was not an easy 2 years. And it's so frustrating and discouraging, I know, when you're not in recovery yet and you're wondering how long it's going to take and how long it's going to be hard and what the future's going to hold. But I just, please don't give in to the temptation of worrying you're not healing fast enough or you're still avoiding too much, because there's a lot of things in religion to avoid and you can't stop avoiding all of them at once. You just can't. You just can't. So maybe you're not going to be going to church for a long time because you're just working on not avoiding prayer. That is okay. There's no right or wrong answer, contrary to what a lot of religions will say about how important it is to be all in all the time. They don't have OCD. They don't know the journey, and it's one step at a time. So if you have avoidance and you struggle with avoiding as a compulsion, just remember this is the long haul, and you don't have to go from avoiding all religious triggers that ever existed to being a fully 100% active, how you used to be member within a week or two. It's not going to happen. And it's okay. It's okay. It is okay. And it does not matter if you worry what God thinks about that or what anyone else thinks about it. That's part of OCD treatment, is sitting with the uncertainty and not knowing what anyone else thinks or what God might think. It's just saying, I value getting better from OCD, and that means doing this ERP and doing this therapy, and I have to do that one step at a time. And I promise you, one day you'll look back and you will be in OCD recovery and you'll have done it. And I, of course, want to be there to support you through that whole entire journey as you avoid avoidance. With scrupulosity OCD, be careful not to get in this cycle where you're replacing the avoidance with another compulsion, like asking for reassurance or researching and saying like I used to go to my husband and be like, do you think it's okay that I'm not going to church this week? Sweetie, that's a compulsion. Yep, it is. It's just learning to not know if it's okay if you're not going to church this week. So be careful. If you're going to work on one thing, try your best to sit in the sucky anxiety without replacing the avoidance with something else so that you can really move towards healing. Please work with a therapist. OCD recovery is about stopping the compulsions, not the thoughts. I still get intrusive thoughts. I will for the rest of my life, but I'm not emotionally attached to them anymore. Most of the time, obviously, I'm not perfect. I still have slip-ups, probably once a month or more, with different thoughts that get me sucked in. But just remember, thoughts are not something that you can control. Your reaction to the thoughts, whether that is the emotional reaction or the compulsion, is what we're working on with OCD recovery. And that sounds discouraging when you're in the middle of it, but I promise, life in recovery means those thoughts, they don't feel so big, and they're not such a big part of my life. OCD used to be my whole life. Now it's like a piece. small piece of my life. That's something I'm always grateful for and why I'm so passionate about what I do. I wish you the best of luck in your OCD recovery journey, and I will talk to you next week.